The year is 1961, and following the breaking of the news that the Soviets had hit the moon in 1959 last year, the United States Congress decided that a more scientific effort would be needed in order to catch up to the Soviet Union. Unfortunately, as of last year, they already had the budget planned and they already had a few satellites prepared and ready to go. And last year ended with the beginning of the construction of the Molniya-1 satellite. Of course, not wanting to waste all the progress, Congress decided they would just appropriate the satellite and utilize it as a communications satellite. It was initially intended to be the first of a network of satellites that would rise up above the horizon and into the higher latitudes before hovering there for a few moments and dipping back down below the South Pole. The Molniya satellite is now going to be a solitary vehicle. The Molniya-1's mission, though initially intended as a communications satellite, will now serve a slightly different function. Though still sponsored by Navcom, it will now retransmit Soviet communications back down to the United States. When the satellite passes over the Soviet Union, it will collect communications, and then it will retransmit them back down to the United States when it passes over the United States, allowing the United States to then spy on the Soviet Union's progress in space. And here we are on April 8th, the Tian-13F is launched aboard the Kuruk 2, a very reliable launch vehicle, as we have used it multiple times since 1960. The Tian-13F, you might note, is a little bit out of order since the last satellite we launched was the Tian-9. The Tian-13F, though, is a satellite that was pushed up in response to the Soviet Union's rapid advance in space technology. The 13F is a satellite that is capable of flying over the poles of the Earth, taking pictures, storing them into a film canister, and then returning those film canisters down to the Earth. Now, this is something that was initially planned for the Tian-8F. However, limits in the the capabilities of the technology, and limits in the capabilities of our vehicles to safely return that film canister back down to the Earth prevented any further interest in that program at that time. However, now all those capabilities have been a bit more refined, and we are ready to go with our first film return launch in 1961. It seems a bit late to me, but better late than never. Of course, we would be using that AJ-10 mid-range engine here, and we're launching a big pusher stage, a very standardized pusher stage minus our solar panels that we usually include. The film canister on board has enough electric charge for about 16 hours, and this will power the satellite going forward. And on top of that pusher stage, attached via a truss network, we have a camera plus its film canister launcher. And we are going around the Earth a few times, taking our pictures of the Soviet Union, just trying to check up on their space progress. Unfortunately, we only got a few passes, but it will be more than enough for us to further understand the Soviet Union's goals in space. Of course, the rocket, utilizing that amazing reignition feature of the AJ-10, reignited its engine, slowing us down to about 6,400 to 6,500 meters per second. Coming down out of orbit, we spun up the vehicle, and then it sent our film canister flying out the back. We had a momentary scare there as the film canister flipped around end over end, but then it found its proper heading as we had designed it with its aerodynamic features, allowing it to settle into a nice flying position here with the heat shield facing forward. This is still a beryllium heat shield, so it's not really capable of ablating off or really reducing the heat, so we had to have such a steep trajectory if we were actually able to survive. Of course, the film canister would come down with a triple parachute and land just off the coast of Australia for our allies in Australia to recover. The film would then be shared with the United States very shortly thereafter. And here we are on June 5th with the TN-10 on top of a Kuruk-2. This is the satellite that was intended to follow the TN-9 before we pushed up the launch of the 13F. This satellite will be designed in order to measure the gravity field of the Earth. One thing we noticed on previous launches was that the gravity field was egg-shaped, odd-shaped, and lumpy in certain areas, something that was inferred based on the slowing and accelerating of certain satellites in their orbit beyond what was expected should the Earth have a spherical gravity field. And as the TN-10's mission just begins, starting with a few months of readings, we get news from the folks back at the science building analyzing the photography that the Soviet Union was working on something big. No announcements have been made out of the Soviet Union yet, but they were working on a very large rocket that has never been seen before. And the United States has nothing quite to compare to it yet. Unfortunately, no more knowledge of this rocket was gained, and we simply will have to analyze the footage a bit later. We only saw the rocket rolling out to the pad. It had an extended upper stage compared to the previous R-7s. And here you can see the final moments of the TN-10 reaching its desired orbit, raising its altitude to the desired height, which is approximately 200 to 300 kilometers in altitude. Following the achievement of the TN-10's final orbit, the entire stack would spin and rotate to a vertical orientation relative to the plane of the sun and spin up, allowing the maximum solar exposure for all of its panels on the hexagon body. On July 30th, the news had finally broken. This was a race. The Soviet Union had sent a human into orbit. This is truly something that Congress had never expected the Soviet Union to be capable of, something that Congress had never expected the Soviet Union to attempt, and now in conjunction with their two missions to the moon, Congress is really starting to feel a little bit uncomfortable with the idea that the Soviet Union might be far more advanced than we had even thought before. The TN-11 would be launched on this day, and it would reach orbit. The purpose of the TN-11 would be to map out weather on Earth. Of course, we are still working with that budget that was appropriated to us back in 1959 when Satish Dahwan argued for moon missions. But I think going forward, Congress will have different plans following the end of this year. They will want to appropriate more funding towards human spaceflight and more funding towards lunar missions and beyond even. The TN-11's weather mission will be very short, something that we expect the TN-11 to last for around 60 to 80 days in orbit, though it still has the same body as previous satellites. Its battery capacity is not quite as high as those previous satellites, considering it is utilizing far more with its radar scanner. This radar scanner will try to map out storms before they hit the coasts of the United States, and perhaps even map out storms over the continental United States. While this weather mapping certainly does have some scientific merit, the larger purpose of this mission was designed as a way to get the broader public interested in the potential of the Aurora Space Program. Obviously, the military had ideas and plans for the program going forward, but the public has not yet benefited from the program's successes. And so Satish Dahwan had planned out this mission back in 1959 as a way to intrigue the public and demonstrate to them the capabilities of the program to affect daily life. And here we see a new feature of the Aurora Space Program, something that we're testing out. We decided to deorbit our second stage, just to clear up some debris in orbit and ensure that the second stage does not bounce into or destroy any satellites while they hit each other at a rapid velocity. Of course, that's not something that we really are too worried about, but it would be nice to clean up our debris. And on the October 4th of 1961, the TN-12 aboard a Kuruk 2-2 is launched. The 2-2 is 2 for the designation of the vehicle as the Kuruk 2, and the second 2 is for the 2 strap-on caster rocket motors attached to that first stage. The TN-12 will be a mission largely a continuation of the radiation scan missions that we have been performing up until this point. It will be attempting to reach an altitude of around 300 kilometers for its periapsis and enjoy an eccentricity of about 0.75 and an orbital period of around 12 hours. Now, most launches up until this point didn't rely on the full capability of the Kuruk launch vehicle, except for perhaps the TN-9 launched aboard the Kuruk 2-1, which used a strap-on booster just to get that slight bit of Delta V boost out of it. Now, this one relies very heavily on the capabilities of the Kuruk 2 launch vehicle. With those 2 strap-on boosters, it will need all of the fuel on board to be able to reach this orbit. It is very highly eccentric, and it is also perhaps the highest periapsis that will be launching an orbit of this kind from. It's very difficult for these vehicles to reach that orbit and must do Hohmann transfers to be able to achieve its certain periapses or apoapses. Of course, this program would be nothing without its radiation satellite launches, though they are starting to get a little bit boring. This launch is largely responsible for mapping out the outer belt of the radiation fields around Earth, something that we noted that it existed, however, we had no way of reaching that point before now, and we had no way of mapping out the radiation before now at that point. So this satellite is going to be largely responsible for mapping out the differences between the inner and the outer belt. You can see it also has an extended third stage, just a little bit stretched out to maximize the potential of that third stage pusher, and we removed the solar panels to minimize its weight. A beautiful shot here of the AJ-10 igniting. It's really probably the most harmful chemicals are being pushed out of the end of this rocket, but luckily no human will ever have to inhale them. But those gases definitely are pretty harmful if they're giving off a color like that as they burn. Of course, this mission will probably be a success. However, one thing is for sure. We will need to continue to advance our rocket's capabilities. The Kuruk-2 was really pushing up against the limits of its capabilities in this launch. However, we do have a vehicle that you have seen earlier on in this episode. It is the Kuruk-3. The Kuruk-2 can push about 1.5 to 2 tons into Earth orbit if it has the proper configurations, but it is designed to only push 1 ton into Earth orbit, low Earth orbit, that is, around 250 kilometers. Kuruk-3, however, is capable of pushing up to 3 tons into low Earth orbit. Even more, actually, if we get the angles right and the launch attitude. And if we were closer to the equator, we could probably do up to 4 tons. However, we are not close to the equator, and we have to live with what we've got. Here you see the deployment of the TAN-12 satellite. Once again, spun up in the vertical orientation relative to the sun in order to get maximum solar exposure. And something that I didn't tell you. As of April 12th, 1961, Satish Dahwan had resigned from his position as the administrator of the Aurora Space Program. This was largely in response to the Soviets getting humans to orbit before the United States. He resigned mostly in protest of that. Satish Dahwan had been with the administration for some time, and we don't blame him for wanting to leave. However, we are now at a loss. Who should we choose to be the next leader of our administration? No one can quite fill the boots of Satish Dahwan in those early years of our program. We are now without a head, and an executive council will take the reins for the time being. And you can see here in the end, this is a bit of a breakdown of what happened in the episode. We are now picking up some new programs. We already had those lunar contracts. You may have noticed in an extras episode, I might have said that, or maybe at the end in the sort of backstage talks, I might have mentioned that we had the lunar contracts picked up. Now we have picked up crewed orbit. This will really supplement our funding as the lunar contracts are coming close to the very end. We have all the building upgrades done for the lunar program, the early lunar impactors program, but we still need the launches to actually happen. We have a couple vehicles capable of doing those launches in the works. We have the Kuruk-3, which is probably capable of doing the lunar impactor and perhaps the lunar flyby. Well, if it can do the lunar impactor, it can do the lunar flyby. And we have the Kuruk-3B, the Kuruk-3 Heavy. I can't exactly remember what I named it, but it is a Kuruk-3 with 2 smaller side boosters strapped on, and it really pushes the limits of that first stage probe core. We've maxed it out, and we also have a launch pad that is completed for it. Right now, our first launch on the Kuruk-3 will probably be a demonstrator and a further launch of the communications array that was initially planned as Molniya arrays, but they have been rescheduled and replanned as Globstar satellite arrays. Sort of in low Earth orbit, maybe not, but they will be spread out and dealt with by their respective companies. but for the future, we are planning on using that Kuruk 3 Heavy to get lunar orbit, to get early lunar impactors, and possibly even the lunar orbiters, lunar landers going forward. Those probes are going to be essential towards our program. And I'll talk more about the Kuruk 3 Heavy once we see it. But for now, thank you very much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this episode, even though we're starting to pick up our launch cadence again. So I'm very excited about that. And if you enjoyed, please leave a like and subscribe and leave a comment below. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.